Hello, my name is Matt Williams. I am the Access Fellow at Jesus College at the University of Oxford, and I'm going to be talking to you about the LNAT test, which is the National Admissions Test for Law. It's used by Oxford University for admissions to all of our law courses. It's also used by a number of other British universities to assess who would be the best candidates for applying. I'm going to start this video by talking a little bit about the sort of the whens, the whats, the whys, the hows, the wherefores about the test. Then go through my 3 Ps of fundamentally important preparation. And then I will go through the test itself and give you some of the top tips that I have to maximize your performance. So first of all, let's talk about the whens, the whats, the whys, and the wherefores and all of that about the test. Now, first of all, what is the test? The test is a mixture of comprehension exercises and short essays. And they are designed to test the fundamental skills of a lawyer. They are not knowledge-based tests, so you're not going to be tested about how much stuff you may know that's pertinent to the study of law. They're testing your skills. You can practice your skills, and practice does indeed make perfect with regard to this particular test, but you don't need to revise particular facts in order to perform well. Why? Why do we use these tests? Well, law degrees in the UK at the Russel Group Unis, the top competitive universities, receive a lot of applicants, and we need to be able to discriminate in a way that is as fair as possible. So whilst we utilise A-levels and other high school qualifications to assess the quality of candidates, that is not sufficient because people are doing so well in A-levels and other things like the IB that we need another way of working out who has the best potential to perform on course. So we utilize the test. We are not using the test as a way to discriminate against people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Indeed, the way that A-levels and school qualifications work tend to be to the advantage of those who are more privileged. So one of our motivations for utilizing a test is to actually level the playing field. I'm sometimes told that these admissions tests are unfair or biased against people from poorer backgrounds and from lesser performing schools. Actually, the motivation is precisely the opposite. So don't go into the test with a degree of sort of cynicism. The test is there to support people and to give them a fairer chance at admission. So that's the why. How do we utilize the tests? Well, the test is a piece of data amongst several that we utilize, and we take a holistic view of applicants for law, but it is correct to say that the test is a very important predictor of who gets selected to come up for interviews at Oxford and at the other universities that utilize this test. Because it's a relatively reliable predictor of someone's on-course performance, we put a relatively high degree of weight on it as data for making the best admissions decisions. I can't give you a precise weighting as to how important, say, the personal statement is relative to A-levels, relative to the admissions test, but certainly the admissions test is one of the best predictors of who gets invited to interview, and therefore investing a decent amount of time preparing for it is a very sensible idea. Okay, where can you find out the information that you might need in order to perform well on this test? Well, there are a lot of great resources out there, including on the University of Oxford website. It's worth noting, of course, that even if you're not planning on applying to Oxford, you're more than welcome to use our resources. So don't feel that you can't. But let me just show you where to find some of the core resources. So if you go to ox.ac.uk, which is the Oxford main website, and you scroll down to the bottom where it says undergraduate admissions, and you click on that, and then you go down again, and you can find courses. Okay, and then you move down to admissions requirements. You see this says table of admissions requirements. Sorry, I haven't used my glasses because I'm half blind. And then if we scroll all the way down, we can find law, if I can see it. Ooh. Where is it? I've gone too far, haven't I? Can't even spell. It's a bad sign. Here we go, law, jurisprudence. And there you can see in the 4th column, there's a little hyperlink to LNAT, and we click on that, and there we can get some of the key information. So what is the LNAT? How do I register? Obviously that's an important part of the logistics of the test. You need to make sure that you're registered in good time. If you don't take the test, your application won't be considered at all, so you must make sure that you're registered to take the test. And when do I take the test, and how do I prepare? And if you click on how do I prepare, then there's lots of useful resources. There's an online simulation of the test you can take. And there's some past papers, one of which I'm going to go through briefly today in this video. And there's also some useful further resources that you might want to check out as well. Okay, so that's where you can find some of the core resources if you want to prepare, and you should prepare, because I've got 3 particular P's of preparation that I would like to share with you. The first is physiological, the second psychological, and the third is practical. Now, it might seem a little bit odd to start with physiological preparation, so let me just explain myself. When we come to looking at the test, you'll see that it is almost as much a test of your intellectual stamina, your resolve, as it is your intellectual abilities. In other words, it's pretty grueling. It's hard. You've got 2 hours and 15 minutes, 2 sections to the test. The first section of which you have 95 minutes, and you have to go through 12 short essays, read the whole thing, and then answer multiple questions. It takes a lot of stamina to get through that. So it really doesn't matter whether or not you're the smartest person on earth. If you can't maintain your intellectual form because you get fatigued too quickly and your abilities deplete very quickly, then you perform badly. So you need to look after your body. And that will help the performance of your mind. Bear in mind that lots and lots of people will be taking this test, and the margin of difference between a very competitive performance and an uncompetitive performance comes down to tiny, tiny fractions of a percent of marks. So it could come down to whether or not you get 1 question right relative to the other, hundreds of people that are taking this test. So you want to make sure you get that question right. And that means it could come down to something like, how rested are you? How well prepared, how nourished are you? I know this sounds a little bit odd, but if you think about a performer at any sort of high level, be it sports, be it dance, whatever, when they're at the top of their game, they're thinking about everything in their life and how it can help them perform to their best. Well, you're competing at the highest level of academia. So you need to similarly think, how much does every aspect of my life contribute to an apex performance? Okay, so what does that mean in concrete terms? It means that, first of all, you've got to have good sleep. This is often overlooked by teenagers. I certainly did it myself when I was at school. But it's fundamentally important, right? 7-8 hours a night at the same times every night is crucial. Those that do not get enough sleep see their cognitive abilities impaired quite substantially. So that's the first thing to knock on the head. If you're staying up very late, if you're having a very sort of disordered sleep pattern, it's no good, and you're just going to be impairing your performance. And this will be true of all of your academic pursuits over the next few years, not just, of course, this admissions test. The next thing is nutrition. The brain is a very energy greedy organ. There's various estimates as to how much it takes from you, but somewhere in the region between 20 and up to about 40% of your daily calorie intake. So a huge proportion for just 1.5 kilos of grey matter between your ears. Extraordinary proportion. And the inference is that you need to make sure it's got the energy to work on a sustained basis for a long time. Okay, it's no good if you can have fantastic brain performance, but only for 20 minutes. You will not succeed in this test. You need to maintain the top level of concentration for 2 hours 15. Now, you may think, well, I do that for all of my A-levels. I've done that for my GCSEs. This test really stretches you beyond your comfort zone. And lots of people who are the best in their schools come a cropper in this test because they simply take for granted that they can do it. And they're frankly not ready for it. So you need to make sure you're thinking about, am I eating enough? And am I eating the sort of foods that are going to help my brain perform well? Which means healthy food, vitamin rich, because the brain needs those vitamins to perform well. Okay, so that's another part of the physiological preparation. And the third, fairly straightforwardly, is hydration. If you're dehydrated, I mean, in very simple terms, your blood gets thicker, and thick blood is not terribly good at servicing your organs, including your brain. So you need to make sure you're hydrated. Now, again, I'm not trying to patronize anyone. I used to make similar sort of errors of judgment when I was younger in terms of not treating my body very well, and then being surprised that I got very easily tired, that my concentration levels would lapse and so forth. So I'm just trying to share my own mistakes, if you like, with you so that you don't make the same mistakes. But do take care of your physiological health, because that will affect your cognition as well. The second P is psychological preparation. These tests are hard, really hard. And therefore, if you find it hard, that doesn't reflect on you. That doesn't mean that you're unintelligent. It doesn't mean you're not capable of competing at the world's best universities. It just means that the test is hard. And the upshot is that you mustn't psych yourself out. A lot of students, when they confront this test, they start allowing these intrusive thoughts, which are very common, perfectly normal, but they allow those intrusive thoughts along the lines of, you're not good enough, you're finding this difficult because you're not intelligent enough. They allow those to dominate their thinking and to drain away their energy through just nervousness. And again, that's not a terribly efficient use of your mental faculties. So you need to, it's fine to be anxious. That's very common. But you need to make sure that it's the sort of anxiety that's going to motivate you to perform at your best, and not the sort of anxiety that just overwhelms you. So try and knock on the head any of those thoughts that tell you this test is hard because there's something wrong with you. Everyone finds the test hard. It's designed to be very stretching and grueling, and therefore it doesn't reflect on you. And this links to the third P, which is practical. The more you practice the test, the more comfortable you will feel with it, the more able you will feel of performing at your best for a sustained period of time. Now, let me be blunt. I have worked with a lot of incredibly bright people who simply did not prepare enough. They did not practice enough of the tests, and therefore they got deselected. They didn't even get invited to interviews at the universities that they wanted to be interviewed at. And it was blindingly obvious to me that they weren't going to be invited because they didn't look at a single test. They frankly took for granted that they would be fine. They had been told that this was a skills test, and I can't hone my skills, so I'll be fine. When of course you can hone your skills. That's like saying that a chef can't improve their knife skills, or a basketball player can't improve their shots. That's such nonsense. And when we say it about academic skills, it really annoys me because it's so obvious that of course you can improve your academic skills with practice. So don't get complacent. You must practice this test. Given how important a predictor it is of success in the admissions process, it really needs to be one of your primary objectives is practice, practice, practice. Okay, very, very important, but often overlooked. And it breaks my heart when I see people that I've been working with in Access for a long time, people that really deserve a place because they're bright and they're committed and they're wonderful human beings, but they just, through various reasons, have not committed enough time to practicing the test. There are multiple tests on the website. You need to do them all of them. And if you don't do them all, you don't seriously want a place at these universities. I really am going to be as straightforward as that. You just don't want it enough if you don't practice them all. And that's fine. Maybe, this is telling you something that you need to know, but you should really be getting through all of these. And there's not actually that many with regards to the LNAT, so it's not too burdensome a request, but you really need to practice them all. Now, of course, I know that, you have busy lives at this point in your in time. You're busy working on, say, your extracurriculars, you're working on your schoolwork, you've got a social life. Obviously that's all completely reasonable and fine, but you must carve out time. And my recommendation is little and often. So don't just sort of say, right, I'm going to do a mock exam every single day, because that's going to be too onerous. Carve out 20, 30 minutes per day, go through a couple of questions, keep it going. Maybe do one exam under time conditions, just so that you can really get a sense of what the full strenuous lump of an exam is going to be like. But don't just constantly do mocks, because that will be too much and you'll probably demotivate yourself and give up. Anyway, so those are the 3 Ps: physiological, psychological, and practical preparation. So let us now look at the test so that we can go through it. Now I need to change what I'm sharing, so just bear with me for a second. Okay. So okay, so here is the test itself. And as you can see, it's got two separate sections. So we'll start with section A, which is the multiple choice section. And it will tell you, as it does on the front here, that the section is divided into 12 subsections, each of which has between 3 and 4 questions. Therefore, in total, you've got 42 multiple choice questions and 95 minutes to answer them. So that means you've got a little bit more than 2 minutes to answer every single question. But when you look at how much reading you have to do to answer those questions, you'll realize what I was talking about with regard to the physiological preparation. Okay, so this is one subsection. So that's one essay that you would have to read in order to answer just 3 questions. All right, and there are 12 of those essays. So that's an awful lot of reading. You have to get through all of this in just over an hour and a half. That's a lot, an awful lot. Now, quite obviously, they're testing your ability to read and comprehend a lot of complex material quickly, because that's what lawyers do, right? That's the lawyer's stock in trade, is reading, comprehending, coming up with solutions as fast as possible. So, it's a reasonable test, but it's hard, really hard. And hence, if you are not rested, you're not going to perform well on this. You will lapse in concentration. You will not perform as well as you could do. So you must prepare, okay? And also, as I say, with the psychological preparation, if you find it hard to get through all of those questions, well, good. That's because it is hard. It's not something that you need to berate yourself for. That's just the nature of the test. Okay. And then section B is an essay, and I'll talk about the essay a bit later. But let's start with section A. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the questions, but I'll go through one just to share with you some of my top tips about how you can perform at your best in this particular part of the test. Okay, so what I suggest is that when you've got this huge lump of text that you have to read and comprehend, actually your best bet, to my mind, although it is a personal decision, but I think this is generally speaking a good tip, is to read the questions, the prompts, before you read the text. Because what's likely to happen is that you'll read through the whole text, then you'll read the questions, and then you'll have to read through all the text again just to find where the pertinent data is. But if you read the questions first, you know what you're hunting for before you start hunting for it. So it just makes your use of time much more efficient, I would suggest. Okay, so I think that's something you should try. So you probably won't fully understand the questions in the first instance, but I still think it's worth reading them so that you get a clearer sense of what's expected of you. Okay, so which of the following pairs is not used in opposition? So we're looking for pairs in opposition. So I'm just going to highlight that so that I remember it. The writer takes the view that, so we're looking for the writer's view. And finally, why might voluntary euthanasia be against Kantian principles? Okay, so now we know what we're looking for. We can now read the text and be a little bit more efficient in doing so. Now, how should you read and highlight a text? Again, there are multiple methodologies you could employ here, but it can be quite difficult to work out what is the most pertinent data to highlight. Now, we've already tried to focus our attention by highlighting bits of the questions. But what next? What I quite often see when students are taking tests like this is that they start highlighting almost every detail. So by the end of it, the paper looks a bit like this. So they've highlighted almost everything. And that's not necessarily going to be very helpful to you when you're trying to focus on the really pertinent and important data that you need to extract. So how can we make that process a bit more effective? Another thing to bear in mind is that because you're likely to quickly fatigue by reading lots of text and having to concentrate for a long time, you need to think about how to make sure that you ensure your concentration stays and it doesn't lapse. And that's quite a difficult thing to do because frankly, we get so used to reading stuff as human beings that after a while you tend to drift away from concentration. Now, to use a little bit of sort of technical neurophysiology, because you're all such accomplished readers, your frontal cortex tends to sort of, if you like, switch off a little bit when you're reading because you're so adept at it that you start to just scan the page. But in doing so, you might miss a lot of details. Now, we can actually measure this, and the brain will be releasing what are called alpha waves, which is some evidence that you're doing something that's quite routine, that you're almost unconsciously just flowing your mind across the page. Now, that's fine. That's a good sign. That means that you're a very practiced and skilled reader. But it's quite a good idea to make sure that there is a way that you can ensure that you keep your mind engaged throughout the reading process. And again, you can measure this by the emission of beta waves, which is evidence that the frontal cortex is being stimulated and therefore that you're concentrating more. Okay, so how can you ensure that you concentrate more? Well, my tip would be to highlight adjectives and adverbs as you're going through the text. And in particular, those that are pertinent to the questions that you've already highlighted. Now, why adjectives and adverbs? Well, for a start, it'll ensure that you concentrate more because you'll be scanning the page and you'll be looking out for those adjectives and adverbs. So rather than just unconsciously allowing the text to flow over you, you'll be looking for those particular parts of speech that are important. And they are important because what you're predominantly being asked to do is to comprehend an argument. So in all of the 12 essays, you're being asked to read and understand someone's claims about a particular idea or phenomenon. And people betray their analysis most often in association with adjectives and adverbs, because that's when they start to explain their perspective. Their opinions are often couched in adjectival forms. Okay, now not always, of course. You can use nouns, you can use verbs to express an opinion, of course. But I think there's a strong correlation between the use of adjectives and adverbs and the expression of opinion. So that tends to make for a more efficient way of highlighting the bits in the text that are most useful to you. When the author is narrating facts and just explaining and describing a particular phenomenon, that's not usually the most useful parts of the text, and therefore you can probably skim over those a little bit more quickly. Okay, so a couple of reasons why it's important, just to reiterate. First of all, because it engages your brain, because you're looking out for those adjectives and adverbs, so you're not just allowing the text to flow over you, you're keeping yourself concentrating throughout. And secondly, because then you're not going to just highlight the entire text, you're going to highlight the bits of text which are more analytical, because ultimately that's what your mind needs to gravitate towards. Okay, so let me just show you as we go through. And I'm going to read the whole text quite quickly and then go through the answers so that you can understand why the answers are as they are. Okay, so here we go. Traditional medical, well, those two adjectives straight off the bat. Traditional medical oaths and codes prescribe a physician's character, motives, and duties. Typically, they portray ideal physicians as devoted to the welfare of patients and to advancement of the medical profession and medical knowledge. Now, you could keep highlighting medical as adjectives, but that's probably not necessary. Responding compassionately, here we go, that's an important adverb, to the suffering of patients, humbly mindful of the limits of their curative powers and the harms they may unintentionally cause. The Hippocratic injunction, strive to help, but above all, do no harm, is the ruling maxim. Although still supported by religious texts and medical tradition, I'm not going to keep highlighting medical. This ideal physician is increasingly criticized as paternalistic, excuse me, too willing to act on judgments of a patient's best interests without the patient's knowledge or consent. To treat without consulting a patient is to assume that a patient does or should share one's own assessment of the risks, benefits, and burdens of treatment. But current hospital specialists, it is said, rarely know their patients or themselves well enough to make this assumption without serious risk of ignorant arrogance. Given hospital hierarchies, such paternalistic physicians are seen to resemble Victorian patriarchs. Okay, right. So let's keep going. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down a bit. Some physicians reject such criticism as intervention by lawyers, philosophers, and feminists, and other social critics ignorant of the realities of medical and hospital life. But the neo-paternalists admit that physicians should attend. Oh, no, sorry, should is a verb. What am I doing? Pardon me. Should, although it's clearly a bit of analysis, should attend more carefully to a patient's desires and to give them greater weight in arriving at a treatment of choice. Unmollified critics, however, continue to insist that treatment choice belongs to the patient, however imprudent, and not the physician, however attentive and knowing. To curb Hippocratic paternalism, I guess you can say that's an adjective, they define a range of patient-specific rights to be told about and choose among alternative treatments, including a right to refuse or even life-saving treatment. These rights confer adult status on patients whom paternalists regard as children, replacing quasi-familial with quasi-legal relations. A patient's free and informed consent reflects an implicit therapeutic contract, defined and reviewed as treatment proceeds, A physician who treats without such consent is not a patriarch, but a batterer. Goodness. Less litigiously, these rights define a principle of autonomy traced to Kantian notions of respect for persons and inherent human dignity. Okay. Attempts to apply this principle have raised questions of scope. Is a patient's free and informed consent needed for routine procedures with slight or rare risks? Is consent required if a patient would, in the physician's judgment, be medically harmed by information about diagnosis and prognosis? Are refusals to be honoured even if patients risk death, as do surgical patients religiously opposed to blood transfusion? Does the principle, contra Kant, cover voluntary euthanasia? Can children or mentally ill patients give informed consent, at least for some procedures? Can parents or other surrogates give or refuse substituted consent when a patient is too ill to consider the options or to speak? Okay, and then the next page. Whatever the scope of a principle of patient autonomy, this challenge to paternalism has shifted the categories of concern. Physicians' power, not their character, has become the issue. Consequently, who is to decide has become more pressing than what is to be done. Proper procedure has become as important in medical ethics as correct conclusions. Okay, now you may fairly suggest that I've still highlighted an awful lot of the text there, but can you see that rather than by highlighting whole lines fairly indiscriminately, I've discerningly picked out the adjectives and adverbs. Now, no doubt you'll find some adjectives and adverbs that I missed, but I think these are probably the most important ones that tend to highlight when the author is providing some analysis. Okay, so let's go through the questions. Now, we already have an idea of what the questions are. So how do you deal with multiple choice questions? There are a couple of theories on this. One is that you work out what the answer is before reading the options, and the other approach is to read through each of the options and eliminate the ones that are the least viable until you hit upon the one that is correct. Now, you can also do basically a bit of a mixture of the two, which is to sort of try and work out roughly what you think the answer is going to be and then check against each of the answers. I don't think you particularly need to overthink this, but both approaches are about as equally efficient as each other as far as I can tell. So which of the following pairs is not used as an opposition in the passage? Ideal physician and Victorian patriarch, adult and children, quasi-familial and quasi-legal, patriarch and batterer, paternalism and autonomy. So it's tricky, right? I mean, so we'll have to sort of, we might have to go back and just check all of the different points. But you can start, you know, because we've highlighted the adjectives, we know where it says ideal, we know where it says Victorian. So let's go and start with that one. And we can see that it's here, given hospital hierarchy, such paternalistic physicians are seen to resemble Victorian patriarchs. Well, that's handy because that we know now is the right answer. A is right. So we haven't had to waste our time with going through the other four. It must be A, because it doesn't say ideal physician and Victorian patriarch. It says paternalistic physician and Victorian patriarch. So the correct answer is A. You can, of course, check the other four, but you know, you don't have a great deal of time, so make sure you're being as time efficient as possible. Okay, so what's the next question? The writer takes the view that A, physicians need to change their attitudes. Doesn't say that. You know, the writer's reflecting on what other people have argued, so it's more of a review article than a personal opinion piece. So the writer does not take that view personally, so I think you can discount that. So let's discount that one. Some doctors are too old-fashioned. Again, the writer doesn't take that view. The writer is reflecting on other people that take that view. So I think we can discount that as well. We need to consider the validity of the Hippocratic Oath. Again, I mean, the writer is talking about how others have engaged with that analysis, but I don't think that's the writer's view. The most important issue in medical ethics today is who decides. Now that sounds a lot more viable, because this is the writer is reflecting on medical ethics rather than on what he or she thinks ought to be done by individual doctors. And we can look for medical ethics because we've already highlighted it quite nicely here by focusing on adjectives. And it says, consequently, who is to decide has become more pressing than what is to be done. Proper procedure has become as important in medical ethics as correct conclusions. So we know, therefore, that the correct answer is D. Okay, it is. So then finally, the third question. Why might voluntary euthanasia be against Kantian principles? Now, quick side note here, if you don't know what Kantian principles are, that's fine. Remember, it's not a test of your knowledge. All of the knowledge you need is in the text itself. So if you've never heard of Immanuel Kant and you don't know what his principles are, don't worry about it, okay? Because this is an example of where people can start to psych themselves out. They can start thinking, oh God, I don't know Kantian ethics, I don't know Kantian principles. Is this gonna stand against me? No, it's not, it's fine. So just keep a cool head, keep going. Everything you need is in the text. So why might voluntary euthanasia be against Kantian principles? It's not a medical treatment, it does not respect human dignity, it is contrary to natural law, it undermines the patient-physician relationship, it is not an example of autonomy. Well, let's go and find in the text where it talks about Kantian principles. And again, I think we highlighted this, yes. So here we go, there's Kantian. Less litigiously, these rights define a principle of autonomy traced to Kantian notions of respect for persons and inherent human dignity. Okay, so let's see. Well, that looks like it could be either B or E because it speaks to human dignity and autonomy, but it's not an example of autonomy, so B is a closer fit, but it does not respect human dignity. Okay, so as you can see, that's just 3 questions out of 42, was it, that you have to do? So look, yeah, 42, right? So again, doing that in an hour and a half, just over an hour and a half, 95 minutes, that is grueling. That is really hard. Everyone would find that hard. Okay, so that's why you need to be physiologically prepared. You need to be psychologically prepared, and you need to practice, practice, practice. You must practice as many past papers as you can get your hands on. On the websites, they do suggest various other books you can read, but the most time efficient thing to do is to practice past papers, okay? Maybe a good way to make sure you keep motivated to do this is to look on them as a little bit like crossword puzzles, to sort of spend 20, 30 minutes a day just doing a couple of them, just making sure that you keep your eye in, doing them as fast as possible. That way you won't sort of see it as some terrible drag, you'll just keep it ticking over and prepare yourself nice and efficiently like that. Anyway, let's talk about section B, the essay, right? Okay, so for this you get 40 minutes, which is a reasonably long amount of time. You're not expected to write a long essay, so you don't need to worry too much about that. Excuse me, just going to get some notes up. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the essay options. So the essays are right at the back. So let's go all the way to the end. Right, here we go. So answer one of the following questions. Your answer should be a reasoned and substantiated argument which justifies your response to the question. Okay, so 40 minutes, you really don't have a huge amount of time. So what should be your approach to this? We'll obviously read all of the options, work out which one you're going to tackle. Bear in mind, again, the essays are not tests of your knowledge, they're tests of your ability to structure a response to the question. So what some people do is they tend to pick a question based on what they know the most about. That can be a bit of a mistake because then they are tempted to just provide lots of data, lots of facts about particular events, about particular people, about particular academics or authors that have reflected on these problems. And what they don't do is provide a clearly structured argument. And that's ultimately what the examiner is looking for. So by all means, choose a topic that you're quite familiar with, but don't allow yourself to lose sight of what you're meant to be doing here, which is writing an essay. And an essay is a word derivative from French meaning to try, to attempt to answer a question in a clear and comprehensible way for another person, okay? And I'm going to talk about how to well structure an essay, but please be clear, you are not receiving marks on how much stuff you know, you're receiving marks on how well you structure a response to this question. Absolutely crucial. We see this year in, year out, that lots and lots of people have an impressive range of knowledge that they think is going to push them over the line. It is not. You must write a clearly structured, coherent, response to these questions, okay? Now, another thing to note is that these questions are all quite emotionally engaging. They're tough moral conundrums. And what can happen, therefore, is that people get slightly, maybe even upset, because it can have personally affected some people. So, I wouldn't even say it would be unreasonable to be slightly perturbed if you read a question that has affected your life in some way. But again, you need to try and ensure that you don't waste time and energy on nervousness and emotional matters. You need to make sure that you stay focused. So don't allow the examiners to put you off your game because they're engaging with some pretty heady topics that are quite emotionally charged. I mean, for instance, we've got abortion mentioned here. We've got the wearing of burqas in Western countries. So this is difficult material. But as a lawyer, you will have to engage with difficult material on a professional basis. So that's again why they're using it. Okay, so let's say you pick a subject and you decide to write an essay on it. What are some of the things you need to make sure you do? Well, first of all, you must plan a response to the essay. It is so obvious when someone has not planned an essay. So we mark these essays, we look at them carefully. If someone has not planned, then it's just difficult to read. And you're not helping us, your audience, understand what you're trying to say to us. It's also incredibly common that people don't plan their essays because the mindset is, well, I've got 40 minutes, I need to write as much as I can, I've got to start immediately, no time for planning, and just go. And also, to be frank, in some of this school curricula, in particular A-levels, you're not always marked down for lack of structure in essays. So you're perhaps used to, through a degree of muscle memory, to just writing a response to a question without sufficient planning. Okay, but if you fail to plan, you should plan to fail, because you will not perform well if you don't plan these essays. And I would go so far as to say that you need to be allowing for about 10 minutes, as much as 10 minutes of your 40-minute allotment, planning your response before you write it. Okay, and the primary reason for doing so is because if you don't plan, you effectively will not answer the question. And there are at least 5 ways that people fail to answer exam essay questions, okay? And these come down to 5 I's, okay? Which is that their answers are irresolute, indecisive, imprecise, inconsistent, and indignant. Now, I'm going to go through all of those 5 now, just so that they make sense. But let's start with, excuse me. So let's start with irresolute, right? If you don't plan, you don't know what you're trying to say. And you can therefore end up trying to answer the question without having a clear sense of what your argument is going to be. What is your answer? Okay, you need to have a pithy one-line answer to the question. Okay, so let's take the question on, would you agree that travel and tourism exploit poorer nations and benefit only the richer ones? If you don't give yourself sufficient time to plan, the chances are that you might say something like, I don't know, or, oh, it could be that travel and tourism exploit both poorer nations and benefit richer ones. That it might be that you're just not clear in what you're trying to argue. You need a very precise, pithy, one-line response to the question. And if you don't give yourself sufficient time to plan, you won't know what it is that you're trying to say. So you will be irresolute. You won't have a clear response. Okay? It is not acceptable not to answer these questions. You will perform very badly if you don't provide an answer. It's often tempting in essays to sort of say, well, I don't know. And that's not good enough. An essay is an attempt. It comes, as I say, from a French word to try. If you don't try, you're not showing off your skills of critical analysis. And so you can't reasonably expect a place on these courses if you say, I don't know. It's not good enough. So if someone asks you, would you agree that travel and tourism exploit poorer nations and benefit only the rich ones? You need to give yourself sufficient time to think about an answer, because being irresolute will lead to failure. So you must answer it. You can't say, I don't know. Not good enough. You can't just allow someone else to do all the talking for you. Now's your time to give us an answer, okay? Even if you're not entirely confident in that answer, you still need to try and answer it. All right. The second I after irresolute is quite similar, but it's indecisive. And this is where you sit on the fence. So you say, well, it could be a bit of this, it could be a bit of that. Some people argue this, some people argue that. And you're not entirely clear as to where you would fall on the line. So this is similar to saying, I don't know, but it's where you're giving some thoughts as to what you might think, but you're still not being clear enough. You're still not helping us solve this puzzle. You know, an essay is a puzzle, and you need to help us solve it. You can't say something like, well, some would argue this, some would argue that, because I'm going to be thinking, what do you argue? What is your response, right? When you're a lawyer and you've got a client and you're going into a courtroom, you know, and the judge is saying, well, how does your client plead? You can't start saying, well, some think that she should plead innocent and some think she should plead guilty. You've got to be decisive, okay? Your client's life will depend on it. So you've got to check that temptation of being sort of vague and sitting on the fence, okay? Of course, acknowledge what an alternative perspective might be to your answer, but don't just say, this could be the answer. Say, this is the answer, my answer. This is what other people think is the answer, but this is why they're wrong with respect. Okay, you mustn't be indecisive, you mustn't be irresolute, because if you do either of those two things, you're not answering the question. And the chances are that both of those things will happen if you don't allow yourself time enough to plan, because you will just be going through and providing an answer too quickly, and it'll just be a gut instinct. You need to give yourself 10 or so minutes to make sure you know what it is you're going to say, okay? The third I is imprecision. Now, lawyers trade in language. That's how they make their money. So if you are imprecise with regard to the use of language, you're not going to make a terribly skilled lawyer, okay? So if it says, would you agree that travel and tourism exploit poorer nations and benefit only the richer ones? If you don't use the words exploit and benefit in your answer, you're not being precise enough. That's the language the examiners use, and that's the language you should use. It's very common for authors in these exam essays to start utilizing lots of synonyms to say something other than exploit and something other than benefit. The problem with that is that synonyms are rarely perfectly synonymous with the word that you are substituting it for. And so you're therefore peeling away from the point of the question, and just through lack of discipline. If the examiners have used the language of exploit and benefit, you must do so as well. You must, because that sort of sloppiness and imprecision is very bad. It looks dreadful. And so again, you must plan so that you're sure when you're going through the question that you are directly laser targeted on what the examiner wants an answer to, not something that you think you would like an answer to. You're keeping to the point. Okay, think about, when a politician's asked a particular question on the TV and they start just peeling off onto something they'd rather talk about. It drives everyone nuts, doesn't it? Because you just think, no, answer the question. Well, that's what I'm afraid markers will do if you start veering off the point. You must make sure that you're answering the question posed, and you must repeat the language that the examiner has used back at them when framing your response. Okay. The fourth I is inconsistency. Now, this is a very common problem from failure to plan. This is where you start with one argument and you finish with a different one. So you might start by saying that, yes, I agree that travel and tourism exploit poorer nations and benefit only the richer ones. But by the end of it, you're actually starting to say, well, travel and tourism exploit richer nations and benefit poorer ones. You're not consistent, and that's because you failed to plan, and you're basically working out your thoughts as you're going, as you're writing. And that is clearly going to be very difficult to understand. So you must be careful not to do that. Okay. And the fifth I is indignancy, or indignant behavior. Now, what this means is that some people don't answer the question because they don't feel it becomes them to do so. They feel it's beneath them to answer the question. And this might sound slightly odd, but I swear, every year we do see a proportion of people that say, I'm not going to answer this question because I don't think it's a very good question. I don't think it's framed very well, or they'll complain about the way the question's been put together, and they'll start questioning the question because they think that sounds terribly clever, and they'll start answering a different question instead. But again, that's like the annoying politician on the television saying, well, I'm not going to answer your question, I'm going to answer my own question. okay, I mean, sure, there could be a reasonable debate as to how well crafted these questions are or whether they're appropriate and blah, 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 but that's not your job. Your job is to answer the questions. Okay, so don't get indignant about the question. Don't sort of go into a tirade about the form of the question. Just answer it. Okay, so those are the 5 I's. So irresolute, you're saying, I don't know the answer. Indecisive, you're saying, well, it could be this, could be that, not sure. Imprecise, you're not utilizing the language of the question, you're veering off point. Inconsistent, you're starting with one argument, finishing with a different one. And indignant, you're saying, I don't want to answer this because it's beneath me. Don't do any of those 5 things because they all basically mean that you're not answering the question. And that's your ultimate goal. You must answer the question. Okay, now I know that sounds sort of really patronizing and obvious, but I swear this happens all the time. You know, easily more than half of people that take this exam commit one of those 5 I's, easily. I would go so far as to say it's getting on for 3/4 of the test takers. So an astonishing proportion of people, because they don't give themselves sufficient time to plan, they don't know what they're going to say, they're not focused enough on the question, and it just makes for a failure to answer. And that's why I'm getting slightly animated, because it hurts me to see such great students throw away their opportunities because they're just not answering the question. Okay, anyway, so how should you plan? So what sort of steps should you take? Well, the first thing to do is to identify what I call the hook word in the question. So the hook word is the word or words that you have to hang your argument off, because it's the focal point of the dispute, right? Each of these questions raises a debate, a dispute, an argument, and there will be particular sort of pivot points in that argument, in the way it's been phrased. Okay, so let's say you're a criminal barrister and you're having a debate against a prosecution barrister, you're the defense. The hook word will be guilt and not guilty. So that's the thing that you're arguing about. That's the key term that both you and the prosecution are going to fight over. You're going to sort of try and make it not guilty, they're going to try and make it guilty, and you're going to be tussling over that particular word. So everything, all of your energy needs to be poured into making sure that you have a case of not guilty. Okay, so that's the focal point of your energy. And each of these particular disputes similarly have focal points that you need to make sure you focus on so that you provide the most effective answer. So let's go through all of them. In what circumstances should abortion be permitted and why? So what's the focal point of that question? Well, it's circumstances and permitted. So that's what you've been asked. What circumstances permitted? So those are the 2 words that need to crop up over and over again, because that's where the debate is focused. In what circumstances should it be permitted? And by providing that degree of focus, by highlighting those words, you can start to enrich your analysis by getting under the skin of what it means to have a circumstance and what it means to permit. Right? Lawyers trade in language. That's how they make their money. They trade in terms like offense, they trade in terms like speeding, they trade in terms like guilty, not guilty. So you need to be an adept trader in language. So when someone says circumstance, think about what that means. You don't have to use a dictionary definition. You can use your own rendering of the word that you think you can sell to somebody else. Circumstance is literally the things sort of in the circle around a particular individual, so the context around them. And permission, well, that's interesting, because permitted here is using the passive form of the verb to permit. So it begs the question, permitted by whom? By what? By what authority? So are we talking about permitted by the state? Well, that's what you'd usually assume. Do we mean permitted by parents and guardians of the woman having the abortion? Do we mean permitted by the spouse? Okay, so it's not stated. So there's your opportunity to really sort of get into the weeds of this particular phenomenon, okay? But by highlighting the hook words, it allows us to increase the depth and interest of our analysis. Okay, question 2. Would you agree that travel and tourism exploit poorer nations and benefit only the rich ones? So exploit, benefit, that's our guilty, not guilty. That's the focus of our argument. Does it exploit, does it benefit? And we're being asked to sort of weigh up the 2, which is a classic sort of lawyer's problem, is to try and weigh up 2 rival perspectives. We've got some scarce resources. How should we work out the distribution thereof? Classic sort of legal problem. The Olympic Games today are less a test of personal athleticism and more a measure of national investment and authority Do you agree? Now, this is a tricky one to try and identify the core focal point of the argument, the fulcrum on which the argument tilts and balances. So less and more are clearly important, but it's sort of less personal, more national. So it's sort of trying to work out whether it's at the micro level that an individual is being tested or at the macro level of the state and the nation. Okay, so that's where the argument tips. Question 4, wearing a burqa in Western countries is just as offensive as wearing a burqa in Arab countries. Do you agree? So offensive here is the not guilty word. This is the hook of the question. Okay. Question 5, women now have the chance to achieve anything they want. How do you respond to this question? So chance to achieve is, I would argue, the hook of that question. Now, why would you highlight this? Well, because it helps you plan your essay. So once you've worked out what the hook word is, or words, you can then know how to structure your paragraphs. Okay, so let's say we're doing question 4, wearing a burqa in Western countries is just as offensive as wearing a bikini in Arab countries. Do you agree? So now we know that we're going to have first paragraph, introduction, pardon my terrible handwriting, introduction. Okay, second paragraph, you ought to define some of your terms just so that your readers know what you mean by certain words. And then you're going to have about 2 or 3 substantive points. You don't have a great deal of space to say much more than that. And that needs to be absolutely tethered to this hook concept of offensive. So offensive part 1, offensive part 2. Okay, then we should probably consider some caveats. So these are counter arguments, because what you don't want to do is completely ignore what other people think, because then it looks like you're ignorant of what they say. And also you need to try and rebut, you need to counteract alternative perspectives. Okay, so you need to make sure you give yourself some space to say, well, this is what other people think, but that's so you demolish it. It's not so that you say, this is what other people think, and oh, they might be right, because that's indecisive. You're not going to win any argument in court by saying, well, the prosecution reckon that my client's guilty. Well, they might be right, because then your poor old client's going to jail, so don't do that. And then finally, conclusion. Okay, so let's just go through the various parts of this. So first of all, introduction, you answer the question, and you answer it in the first line, ideally. Don't mess around. You know, you're trying to sell a particular case to someone. You're trying to communicate to them a solution to this problem. So why waste time by hiding your solution? Say it straight off the bat. You know, if you think about someone pitching a new business to the dragons in Dragon's Den, if anyone still watches that, they say what their business proposal is in the first line. They're not going to sort of hide and pretend and not tell the dragons what the investment opportunity is. So you just blurt out your answer in the first line. So if the question is wearing a burqa in Western countries is just as offensive as wearing a bikini in Arab countries, a good opening line, nice and focused, would be something along the lines of, wearing a burqa in Western countries is not nearly as offensive as wearing a bikini in Arab countries. Knocked it on the head. Very, very clear. Your audience know straight off the bat what you're trying to argue to them. Oh, it's so refreshing to have your hand held as a reader like that, nice and easy. Okay, so introduction, answer the question, and then explain how you're going to answer the question. So why you're going to, in very sort of broad outline terms, why you're going to reach that conclusion, why there is this relative degree of offensiveness between clothing choices in different contexts. Okay. 2, define your terms. What is offensive? What do you take offensive to mean? Don't worry about whether or not you're citing a dictionary definition. It's actually much better to cite your own interpretation of what the word offensive means. And then you need to split up offensive into particular parts in order to make the points that you're trying to make. Okay. And you need to have some sort of logical progression. So try and go through it in some way that makes sense in terms of the way you've segmented offensiveness. Okay, so for example, I mean, you could sort of say offensiveness is both given and taken. So you can sort of talk about the active and passive part of offensiveness and have that as a 2-pronged attack. So you give offense and you take offense. So offensiveness is about how people are projecting out something that is considered to be inappropriate and somehow causing an offence, and also offence is how individuals interpret those stimuli as well. And so that could be a fairly logical way of proceeding through. Right? Then you deal with the caveat. So then you deal with what other people would say is the reason that wearing a burqa, wearing a bikini is not as offensive. Wearing a bikini in an Arab country is not as offensive as wearing a burqa in a Western country. And then you conclude by just summing up everything you said. Just repeat what you said. And if you like, in the conclusion, you can also draw out some inferences, which is where you sort of say, well, here are some of the implications of what I'm saying. And that could be maybe a suggestion for policy change, or a suggestion for public information about clothing choices and how they might offend people in certain contexts, whatever. Okay, so that is the bare bones of a structure, and that will take you about sort of 4 or 5 minutes, and then you can flesh it out and work out precisely what you're going to say, especially in the central part where you're unpacking what the hook word means, what offensiveness means. You can really get into some details, and you get plenty of paper that you can scribble on. So do make sure that you just scribble away before you start writing. And then when you do, your essay will be clear, it'll be very well structured, it'll be logical, it'll be easy to follow, such that by the end of it, it would take a Herculean effort not to agree with you, right? That's what you're going for. You want to be so persuasive that by the end of it, your audience is in the palm of your hand, and they absolutely are on board with your case. They completely follow what you're trying to say. Okay, so lastly, I think it's useful to talk about an excellent essay. I'm often asked, how do you perform really well in an essay? And there are a couple of tricks, if you like, a couple of techniques that you can try. The first is to remember what the essay is for. It's testing your skills of critical analysis. In other words, it's testing your ability to argue a case. Okay, so first of all, you should do exactly what I've just said with regard to structuring a case nice and clearly, because that is a very effective skill at helping you create an argument. So that's an important start. The second thing you need to think about is how you can show off the extent of your skills. Now, let's think about an analogy. Let's say someone is trying to show off how good they are at cooking or how good they are at dancing. If you take one of the sort of reality TV shows like Great British Bake Off or Strictly Come Dancing, if someone wants to show off that they are really good, they basically make their lives a little bit difficult. So if they're baking, they'll bake with some unusual ingredients. They'll use some unusual sort of combinations of ingredients, or they'll use some particularly difficult skills in order to show that they are a slightly better baker than their competition. And likewise, in dancing competitions, they'll choose a dance that's more difficult, or they'll choose a particular maneuver that's very difficult. They'll just make their life a little bit more difficult. So how can you make your life a bit more difficult in essay writing while still, performing well? Well, one thing to think about is to try and identify the questions that you're fairly confident most people would be scared off from answering. So that's likely to be the questions that you're a bit scared of answering, because you think, whoa, that looks really difficult. Now, most people would just ignore difficult questions, but those can be the opportunity for you to shine. Bear in mind, you're not being tested on your knowledge. So even if you don't know a great deal about a particular subject, do you have the capacity to argue about the terms in that question? Almost certainly. You may not know, for example, the relative degrees of offensiveness about burqa wearing in particular contexts, but you can think about the concept of offensiveness and link it to the notion of a particular dress and clothing choices in different contexts. So even if you're not necessarily very knowledgeable about the specific policies, politics, and theology regarding dress, you could still come up with a well-reasoned argument in response to a question like that. So that would be one thing to consider, is don't make your life too easy, because if everyone makes their life easy, then they won't stand out. I mean, it's fairly obvious, but if you want to be the best baker, you need to show off your skills to the greatest extent. So if you choose a difficult question, then you're showing off already. The other thing to do to double down on that sense of difficulty is to argue against intuition, to make your life difficult by arguing the more difficult case. Okay, so some of the top-notch lawyers are the ones that have made a career of arguing difficult cases. And they don't just pick the easy ones. They don't just pluck the low-hanging fruit. They also go for the cases that most other people would think, woof, that is unwinnable. This is just a disaster waiting to happen. But you get a skilled lawyer who thinks, nah, I'm going to see how I can come up with a solution for this client. I'm going to see how I can work out something that could achieve what they're looking for, or at least be not as bad as what they are currently facing. So think about that as well. Which is the most difficult question and which is the more counterintuitive answer? So let's take this question about burqas. Now we need to be very sensitive here because I don't want to offend anyone. So please just bear with me because of course this is a sensitive subject and could cause offense quite easily. So I'm just going to be careful. So wearing a burqa in Western countries is just as offensive as wearing a bikini in Arab countries. Do you agree? Now, I suppose my gut reaction is to argue that wearing a bikini in an Arab country is much more offensive than wearing a burqa in a Western country. Okay, so that's my intuitive response to this. So let's see what the alternative might be, that we sort of say, well, no, I don't agree. I think that wearing a burqa in Western countries is more offensive than wearing a bikini in Arab countries. Now, please be clear, I'm not trying to be a bigot here. We're trying to sort of think carefully about what it means to be offensive. So what we could argue is that I don't agree that it's equally offensive. I think it's more offensive, but that's because I think offense is fundamentally perceptual. It's nothing to do with reality. Perception is not a function of what the real world is like. Perception is a psychic state. And therefore people in the West take more offense from burqas being worn because of what they think it does to the freedom of the individual, but it is not literally more offensive. Okay, so let me sort of be very clear with that, because I'm basically playing around with the concept of offensiveness. I'm saying that it's not right, it's not sort of morally correct to be more offended by people wearing burqas in the West, but people in the West tend to make more of a song and dance about it because they perceive it as some sort of attack on their way of life, and that is therefore considered as more offensive. And there's more of a song and dance made about it in the West than bikini wearing would be in an Arab country. Bear in mind that there are many Arab countries that have seaside resorts all along the Mediterranean coast. Are several Arab countries which have vibrant tourist industries, and so they kind of have to put up with lots of tourists wearing bikinis. And then in Western countries, you get a few people wearing burqas, and that often leads to a bit of an outcry from bigots who think that they should be able to tell other people how to dress. So can you see what I've done there? I've tried to say, actually, I don't agree that it is just as offensive, because I'm trying to sort of come up with a sophisticated notion of what it means to be offensive. So I'm trying to show off my thinking skills, my critical thinking skills. I'm not saying anything that is bigoted in itself, because of course that wouldn't be terribly convincing for most people. But I'm countering intuition, and I'm trying to challenge how people understand the notion of offensiveness. And so that's how you can stand out. You're making your life a little bit more difficult, and that's how you can write a really excellent essay. Okay, so just to sort of finally sum up, what are some of the key themes that we've been talking about? So, first of all, this test is not your enemy, it's your friend. It's your opportunity for leveling the playing field. It is an important way for us to distinguish between fantastically good candidates. You do need to prepare for it very carefully. And you do need to think about not only how much you practice, but also how well you treat your body, how much sleep you're getting, how much good food you're getting, how much water you're drinking. You also need to make sure you don't psych yourself out. Don't bully yourself. Don't treat yourself badly. The test is difficult. If you find it difficult, that's okay. That's what everyone feels. The test itself, 2 parts. First part is a really grueling 95-minute romp through 12 essays, which you have to read and comprehend. There are various ways you can maximize the efficiency of that reading. I would suggest you read the questions before you read the text. I would suggest when you do read the text that you ensure you keep engaging your brain by trying to find the adjectives and adverbs in the text. Also, because those adjectives and adverbs will tend to be highlighting the more opinionated portions of the text, which is ultimately what you're likely to be asked about. And then when it comes to the essay, make sure you answer the question. Don't commit one of the 5 fallacies that can lead to someone not answering the question. Make sure that your answer is clearly planned and structured. And if you want to really show off, make your life a little bit difficult. Don't just ignore the difficult questions and try and think about, well, most people are going to argue this, so I'm going to maybe try and argue that and see if I can get to that conclusion. And you might be sort of tempted to think in the essay, well, but I don't think that. But you're not being tested on whether or not you think or believe something. You're being tested on your ability to make a case. So try and make the most difficult case. You know, it's a bit like, again, going back to the baker analogy, they may not like I don't know, ginger and broccoli cake that they're making, but they want to show off their skills and they think that other people will like it, so they'll go for it. That sounds terrible, by the way, but anyway, hopefully you get my point. Fantastic. Right. Well, I obviously wish you the best of luck. If you've made it to this far in the video, then you are obviously a committed person. So keep it up, keep up the pressure. Practice, practice, practice. Please, this is a battle won in inches. The difference between a highly competitive performance and a completely non-competitive performance is tiny. So you need to make sure that you are on the other side of that line. But yes, I wish you the very best of luck. And thank you for watching. Cheers. Bye.